We had a very exciting week with Prime Minister Modi's visit, and he's now leaving. And I was there all week with him, all across from Houston to New York. Howdy, Modi. And I would say the excitement about India and its prospect of economic growth is tremendous. You have a prime minister who's trying to drive an economy which is at $2.7 trillion to $5 trillion by 2025. And you also have a young population which is coming into workforce on the average 1 million unemployed people coming looking for jobs on a monthly basis into the economy itself. And you have a market opportunity by 2025 of roughly $4.8 trillion, where opportunities are going to come for the international companies as they look at India as an investment arena. And we've been very closely negotiating with USTR to have a trade deal to happen between India and the US. And you have to understand, among the US companies, the last 4 years, they have invested over $75 billion into the Indian economy. And when we look at the US companies have created last 5 years, 3.2 million jobs, direct jobs itself, and they are all high-paying jobs. And what's fascinating is on the annual basis, the US companies roughly contribute $100 billion to India's GDP growth itself. So the market opportunities are tremendous. It's an economy which is going to grow dramatically. The question is the impact on the environment. Is this a sustainable growth? Is this an inclusive growth? Or is it the top 5% getting 85% of the economic benefit? So we have a fantastic panel here, all the way from the Tata Group, which is a over 100-year-old company, structured as a trust. I have Kirloskar brothers who have taken a lead from a industrial manufacturing perspective. And we do have a newer company, when I call newer economy, Zensar, more on the IT services. And then we have academics on my right side focus on giving their perspective. So I am going to start by asking an opening question. We do have roughly 48 minutes left in this session. And my question to the panelist is when you look at India as an opportunity, especially, and I'll start with Zensar here, where do you see the opportunities coming? Where do you see the challenges coming from a vision of a $5 trillion economy by 2025?
So thank you. Thank you, Mukesh, and apologies for my voice. I've been probably talking too much over the last couple of weeks, I guess. I think it's a wonderful question. And let's just drive some context into this of why India, right? And in this whole, fourth edition of US-India Summit, if you actually take a look at some of the very critical data, it actually tells a story. First and foremost is in the last 20 years, if you think about it, the global trade from India has actually gone up by about 11.5 times. It is about $840+ billion today, used to be $75 billion in 1998. And the reason that is important is in the same period, the GDP has actually grown up only by 6 times. So global trade from India, both import and export, is actually leapfrogging by about 70% more than the growth of the GDP. Why is that important? Drive the context of the other two large economies, which is the United States and China. The US and China are in the same range. That means the GDP growth and the global trade growth are almost in the same range. For US, in the 20-year period, it's grown up by about 2.5 times each. For China, it's about 13.5 times each. So India continues to actually leapfrog in the global trade. The second dimension on this also still is that in the United States and India relationship, for which we are actually talking here, US contributes about 10% of India's trade. So roughly about $80-90 billion. and it's equal with China. So India's trade with US and India's trade with China is almost identical. Whereas for US, India is only 2% of the total global trade. The reason I'm actually calling that out is we are at a wonderful time, for actually seeing significant headroom to grow in the relationship between India and United States. The second key mega trend, which is also emerging at the same time, is the global workforce. You talk about, the global Indian, the young youth Indian population. In the same 20 year, from 1998 till 2018, India's population, working population, has actually grown twice as fast as US. It's growing by about 1.5% with a CAGR in the 20 years. US is growing by about 0.7%. And the biggest surprise is actually China. China's population growth is 1/3 of India's population growth in the working class. Now, if you put absolute number, and that is where it becomes even more interesting on why India's story is so credible. India has about 500 plus million of working class people of the 1.35 billion. China has about 790 million of the same 1.39. Headroom for India to grow, hence both in trade as well as the working class people actually coming in. Another 280 million, almost the size of the US population, close to 80% of the size of US population. Those to me, I think, are two fundamental shifts. Plus, the Prime Minister, Mukesh, you talked about it. I mean, he uses this 4D, the demography, the democracy, demand, and of course the decisiveness with which the policymakers in India are really coming out with very, very strong market-aligned growth, inclusive growth. So if you combine all of this, I think it augurs quite well, not just for India, but also for US-India relationship and the world at large, because the two countries are naturally aligned. We heard that in the morning session as well. And the demand for the market with the youth population coming in, the decisiveness of the government, the focus on the global trade, and I'll touch upon, of course, the technology sector that I represent. It all brings together a great, great future for everybody.
Thank you. Mukundan?
So I want to start with one sort of a writer saying that, whatever we call it, the strength and attraction of India also is its biggest weakness. I think having a large population creates its own set of issues. It may be a demographic dividend. It could be a disaster if not handled well. And I think that's the overview with which I want to start. But what does it offer to industries? And it's been highlighted by several speakers on the previous session. And we tend to look at it within the group in terms of three axes broadly. We first look at it in terms of scale. Now, if you want to solve world's problem, if the problems within India are not solved, the world's problem are not going to be solved. You want to solve healthcare in the world. If you address the healthcare in India, the needle in the world will move if India's needle moves. And it offers an opportunity to execute many of these solutions at scale. The second thing which it does offer is at depth, in the sense that you won't have large numbers of people who are resource poor as you have in India. So it gives you another dimension in terms of addressing their needs in a way to pull them out and give them access to best quality services, whatever you may want to pick. And the last is we can't take too long. It also needs solutions which need to go with speed. I think if you take these three dimensions and then you add the whole piece around how do you deliver this in a country which is resource rich, resource poor, I think you get into a dimension of problem solving which can excite any big corporation. I think you can look at it glass half full or half empty, but I think this is really a market which needs to be modeled, which you can then replicate around the world. If you can serve healthcare at low cost, that model can be rolled out in any part of the world. But it is a dimension we need to think about, and I think India offers that unique opportunity right now. In terms of things which we need to build, really, I think if you have to really look at the issue of $5 trillion economy, I think we've got a lot of bottlenecks on the way, which we need to overcome. And I think one area which really belongs where I think it is not just private sector, it is not public sector, but a combination of initiatives together needs to address that is the area of infrastructure. And I want to say infrastructure in a broad sense. It includes infrastructure in terms of telecom, road, everything. Every piece of the puzzle has to be solved for India at scale, which is not seen before. And there are two things which US does offer to address these two this major bottleneck. One is I think US certainly has intellectual capital in terms of technology. And secondly, I think US also has financial capital. India just needs large amounts of financial capital to grow. There's not enough internal capital generation and capital formation. And hence there is a need, I think, both from the perspective of private sector and from the perspective of government, that we make India an attractive destination for capital flows to happen. And whatever we can do in places like this to learn more about what we need to address that single point, how do we get capital in, both technology as well as the financial capital in, would allow for that capital to be put to use in solving at scale, solving at speed, and solving at depth.
Great, thanks. Sanjay?
Thanks. You wanted to hear about the opportunities as well as the challenges. And
Correct,
I think
yeah.
the first thing that we should remember is that, we had an opening up of the Indian economy in 1991. And that really made a huge change in the way that people saw India. The current government, I think, actually has, after many years of not so much reform, but suddenly in the first term, they've put together a huge plan of opening up the economy, of reforms in regulation, in reforms of, the digitization of the different things. I don't know the right word to use, but whether it's banking, whether it's finance, in all these areas, they're actually encouraging huge participation, not only by Indians, but also by foreigners. So India is opening up, and the opportunities obviously are, very large, as both Mukundan and Kishore have mentioned. A huge population, people coming up for jobs, and huge requirements to get into the same kind of development as the rest of the world is. We all want to aspire to be like Western Europe or America and have the same needs and desires. But I think the challenge part of it is, how do we grow in a very different way? We can't afford to have the same kind of growth that America has had or that China has had. We can't have 1.4 billion Indians creating far more pollution. So how do we do it in a much smarter way? And I'm not saying that we are going to be smart about it. It's just that technologies have changed. So how do we adopt the right technologies? And how do we grow, give the same kind of opportunity, give the same kind of development or benefits to our citizens, while not spoiling the world for the next generation?
Okay, thanks, Sanjay.
So what I want to do is to kind of just turn the focus around a little bit onto India as a demand and consumption economy, and the outlook for it over the next, say, decade or so. So clearly, trade and export are important, but the Indian model, unlike China, is different. I mean, there is so much headroom to grow within the country. There is so much of opportunities that need to be taken advantage of internally. And so, one might sit back and say, what are some of the important structural drivers of growth and demand within the economy that might be relevant for the next 10 years? And my own kind of thinking or perspective is that there are at least four very, very important kind of trends or factors that we have to keep in mind when we think about the Indian economy and its growth prospects, which also relates to the challenges that we might face over the next few years. And the first is this unprecedented scale of urbanization in the country. Right? So right now, say about a third of the country is urban, but depending upon which report you read, we are expected to add about 200 to 250 million people to our cities over the next 10 years or so, right? So what this implies is not only challenges, but also growth opportunities. So as we all know, the major Indian cities are completely underinvested and under-resourced, right? So that obviously means a huge infrastructure opportunity and infrastructure challenge. So in all the basic sectors, whether it be housing, whether it be roads and transport, energy, water and sanitation. So there is a big infrastructure investment opportunity that will go hand in hand with the growth of urban India, right? We are going to add maybe 60 to 70, or we will have 60 to 70 cities which are a million plus, and they are going to grow significantly over the next 10 years. How do we manage that growth? Okay? How do we manage infrastructure building within the country? More importantly, as Mukesh mentioned, how do we make our cities livable? How do we manage this growth, the city growth from the current state to maybe 10 years from now, Mumbai and Bombay being less polluted than what it is today, right? So that's the first part of urbanization. The second part of urbanization is what one might see as the concentration of consumption and consumer markets, right? We can expect perhaps, say, 3/4 of the economy to go urban over the next 10 to 12 years. This means that markets become more concentrated, which means that entry into India can become more efficient. Right? If, let's say, the 60 to 70 cities in the country cover 50 to 60% of the GDP, for a country wanting to operate in India, going to market becomes more efficient. Right? So these are kind of the two challenges and opportunities that I see as far as urbanization is concerned. Related to it is what everybody talks about, the great advantage of India, the demographic dividend, right? So we have maybe 50 or 54% of the population below 25. With urbanization, there is obviously going to be increasing migration into the cities. Okay? So there are more young people going to be there, again, crammed into cities looking for productive employment. So I think for the nation, an important challenge is going to be really skills development. How do we productively train, educate, and develop vocational skills for this vast mass of young people who are going to increasingly move from rural to urban? Okay, so those are two. And the third thing that comes to my mind is the digitization of India. Right? So when people typically talk about digitization and digital India, they talk about scale, right? So 700 or 750 million internet connections, 500 to 700 smartphones being available in the hands of citizens. So scale is important. Scale is critical. But I think what is really unique about India as a demand and consumption economy going forward is, I think, the convergence of three things. The first, what the government has put in place and has successfully implemented, digital identification, unique digital identification now perhaps of 1.2 billion Indian citizens. Bringing people into the formal banking and financial system at an unprecedented rate. So recently I read about the progress and the success of the Jan Dhan Yojana connecting, say, 300 million people through their mobile to bank accounts. Okay? And the third thing is the development of payments and transaction platforms. Right? So these three things coming together is actually a multiplier on scale. So not only does India offer scale, but India offers this convergence of these three structural factors, which can make e-commerce and digital business challenging, promising, and a growth engine. And the final thing that I want to say, uh, which is closer to a lot of the work that I'm doing and closer to my heart, is the empowering of women in India, right? So right now, I guess 24% of the labor force is women. And if you look at international indices and standards, it can be anywhere up to 40%, right? Moving the dial from 24 to 40% could be, depending again upon the reports you read, 500 to 700 billion dollar opportunity in terms of GDP growth and obviously associated consumption. But I think, imagine that that was not the case. Imagine that it was only 300, just half of it, 350, right? It's still a huge opportunity. And more importantly, getting the woman in the household into the labor force has implications for the family, especially the children. And given that India is a young country, this is, I think, an important and strategic initiative or imperative for the country.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, growth is imperative, but sustainable growth is challenging. And if you look at out of 12 of the top 15 most polluted cities are in India. You look at the recent crisis in Chennai on water side. If you look at, from an environment perspective, waste management perspective, we have challenges. So the question is how do we maintain the momentum on economic growth while at the same time sustaining our environment and making sure the quality of life improves for citizens? Let me ask Sanjay from a water perspective, because, Kirloskar, you've been quite involved in the agriculture area. And today, 90% of the water of India is consumed by agriculture. How do you basically improve that? And Prime Minister has gone on a vision of saying every house will be connected with water pipeline.
Well, there's a few problems over there. One is bringing water, whether it is to farms or cities. Then there is disposal of water. And the third part is how do you efficiently do this, right? So bringing water to cities or to farms, I think government is investing a lot of money. There are some projects, some of them are controversial, but unfortunately, right? Not unfortunately, I believe fortunately, we are not doing river linkage because that will just raise a lot of other issues. But government is investing a large amount of of money into water management. And this is cities like Chennai or Bangalore, the number of people that are coming in is causing issues where we are not unable to manage the population growth with the bringing in of water. So there are foreign companies and foreign institutions that are investing money in whether it's Chennai or whether it's Bangalore, and government is allowing that to take place. It's at certain times it's the state government more than the national government. The government of India is also has a huge program for irrigation, so do the state governments. Farmers, as you know, in many countries in Europe, are the biggest voters. Largest number of people are farmers, the people who vote. So they have to be kept happy. So government is investing in plans, and some of these plans are very old, which have not been implemented. So step by step, they're putting up irrigation projects to make sure that, I would say it in a different way, that urbanization, the rate of urbanization can be controlled. That people stay in rural India and have have jobs in rural India rather than come to cities. As far as this new program of Har Ghar Jal. I think that's what it's called.
Yep.
I think let's see how it's implemented before I can comment on that.
Well, are you hopeful the effort on the cleaning of Ganges has been going on for ages, that they're making progress?
I hope so. Directly, we do not participate in these programs. Sometime or the other, we do get orders. But it starts with stopping the pollution. There's a large number of industrial units that have set up. And I think this government, as well as the new state government, have been quite strict in implementing the environmental norms. So that is actually, part of the solution is prevention.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they are taking steps. And our government now is far stricter. Even for motor vehicles, they've introduced new laws which are very strict, in fact, have led to a huge outcry. But water is slowly but steadily, I think, being managed. Huge amounts of money is going to be required to do this, but I think it'll be done.
You're hopeful.
I'm quite
Very
hopeful
hopeful.
because the right attitude is there,
Yeah.
and I think the realization is that to have good lives, you need to ensure that you have clean drinking water, and you also dispose of it properly.
Absolutely. Mukundan, India has taken the lead on banning of single-use plastic. And that's a big issue, not only just for India, for the world. But this Prime Minister has said, okay, this is a timeline, we'll stop using single-use plastic. But I don't see a great game plan behind the process. And you as a Tata Chemical do get impacted by that. What are your thoughts on that direction?
So before I go to chemical, let me just supplement what Sanjay has said in terms of water. I think if you look at what government has achieved in the last 5 years, they now have data on the ground. They really know what is the quality of water as Ganges flows. They have put in place, they know that water quality is actually pretty okay now prior to a city called Kanpur, but there is a deterioration. And what we need to start to do is we need to start to make most of the sewage treatment plants functional, whatever exists. And India needs about 5 times the number of sewage treatment plants as we have today just to cope with the load, the treatment load which is there. And I think you can go to Google and you look at a project called Daryavati project, which is which was awarded to our group company. But I'm not saying that because of the group. It's the first of the kind where private sector got involved in a river rejuvenation, and this is next to Jaipur, and it has had a telling impact because we realized while executing that project, it was not just about water. It was about making sure that access to water was there to the community, and the sewage treatment plants, we spent a lot of money, and at the end of the day also getting the routings, getting the piping connected, and it was today I think Jaipur, that river water quality has been improved. The other good news is if you just Google the Chennai, you spoke about Chennai Municipal Commissioner, he came up with a fantastic idea which I think there are many local solutions which we can then run at scale. There is, in South India, there are temple water tanks in every temple. All he did was to desilt every temple tank in Chennai, and today its storage capacity has been increased manifold. So at least they will not have water shortage in the next when there's a lack of rain in Chennai. So I think each state is now pushing ahead in terms of solutions. On the national scale, I think what government has said is that there are 7 river basins, the big ones. If we can address the issues on the 7 river basin from the source to the point which meets the sea, we will solve the problem. What they've said is the main river body they're going to take control of, and the tributaries is where they're inviting private participation. So if there is need for anybody to invest in these sort of projects, I think India is a great place to come in and invest. Now coming to plastic, I think what started as a story where I think the industry was not well prepared and government was pushing, and mainly coming from consuming, the food companies and the consumer product companies which use plastic packaging a lot. And it got implemented in bits and pockets in various sort of interpretations of the same central law which got promulgated. And the best example has been Mumbai and Maharashtra, where they just decided one fine morning they will not allow this plastic bags, single-use plastic. And if you come to Bombay today, you see less plastic than any other part of India, and people have made changes. So I think sometimes regulation has to be implemented, it has to be sternly enforced. I think people find solutions in terms of overnight, you will find the vegetable sellers and fruit sellers on the street are using now paper bags. Uh, how did they find the supply of paper bags coming in, yet it met the demand? I think it's an unusual case study in its own way. But in terms of issues with government, plastic is only one of them. I'm just not going to address the specific issue of plastic. It is the whole process framework is being laid out as the EPR framework. I don't want to go into technicals, but in terms of the way the government is looking at it, it's looking at five broad areas. I just want to lay out the five broad areas. So if anybody is interested in working on these five areas, you could bring your capital and bring your technology to India. One is air pollution, big issue for India. Second is water pollution. Third, what the government puts it, I would call it as a bucket of waste management, whether it's plastic waste management, e-waste management, everything around waste management. And the fourth one is around what I call as, it's a fashionable term these days. Government calls it resource efficiency, we call it circular economy. And the fifth bucket has the least connectivity to all of us. We don't know how to deal from business side is the issue of biodiversity. I think if you think in terms of these five buckets, and if there are technologies here, and if there are capital here wanting to come to India, I think they would welcome it. There is receptivity in Delhi for finding solutions at scale because they realize we're running out of time.
Great. I'm going to come to you, both of you, then I'll open the Q&A. You know, Indian IT has built that brand of India across. And today, the biggest export earner is Indian IT services for Government of India itself. But I think that old model is slipping. The friction is happening, especially in H-1B with the US. Where do you see the industry going from a growth perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. The growth of Indian IT industry over the last 20 years, the same 20-year data that I gave earlier, has obviously been phenomenal. But if you actually pivot from the next 20 years, the model, the technology, the processes, everything that worked for you, not all of that, is going to be applicable. And India, quite frankly, really has to focus on getting its, input, which is talent education system right, because that is not right today. There's a lot of time which the industry companies themselves have to spend on. So 250 million students are in the schools in India. India has 500 million people between 5 and 24. But the education system really needs significant investment. It needs, public-private partnership. Government alone, I don't think, can do everything. So, but it needs to also open up, there are many, many investments which are going on. So if you are able to fix that, the demand of technology is skyrocketing. For every country to retain its competitive edge, you've got to keep technology at the center of it, right? Paul earlier mentioned about whether it's machine learning or artificial intelligence, but, here is the thing, Mukesh. The development in technology is actually happening at the scale of quantum. The development in skill is actually still at the rate of mechanical. And if you don't bridge the gap, it's actually going to be disproportionately difficult for you because technology will supremely pass the capability for people to execute. And that's where, in a very different world, the machines will actually start to take over what you're doing. So India as a country, US, the India-US partnership, and even for the globe, you actually have to find, right levers to invest and right areas to really focus and get the input right. That is where the focus and, the quality has to be. India clearly has the advantage of scale of talent. So this H-1B issue that you talked about, every country, you heard, right, in the United Nations, one end, the administration is talking about you actually need to start becoming more patriotic focused than global focused. On this forum, we are talking about being more global, right? And maybe the balance of both actually has to come for better sense. You cannot be one way or the other. I don't think any country can just survive purely on its own. It's a global world. So, you do need to look at immigration reforms as well. I don't think, just banning this or blanket banning is going to work in long term if the countries have to retain their competitive edge.
Great. Professor Iyer, we talked about sustainable growth. I think inclusive growth is as critical. And the latest data we saw, approximately 300 million Indians are still living on margins of poverty line. And from your perspective, what does the government need to do so they become part of the economic success story, rather than just getting marginalized as time goes by?
Yeah. So I think the first important thing is how do you kind of train these people in productive vocations, not just the formal education or going through the formal education system, but how do you train, say, the young population in rural India productively in specific vocations so that they can be entrepreneurial, they can connect to markets not only within their local communities but to greater India and beyond. So how do we set up a system that that trains this young labor force? I think that is going to be critical. As far as the specifics of training, private and public partnership was mentioned, I think that one of the things that the government can focus on is training the trainers. How do you train in a systematic fashion teachers from K through 12 or the equivalent in India, such that they are able to impart the kind of education and sustain it in a manner that somebody coming out of the 12th grade gets a uniform quality of education across the country. Okay. I think that is one of the things which could be like really important and critical in developing human capital over the next few years.